Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're going to talk about the budget tonight. We're going to talk a little bit about fiscal federalism with my guest, Professor Daniel Beland, who is at McGill University. He's head of what is it? The School of Public Policy on Canadian Government?
No, it's the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada.
The McGill Institute for the Study of Canada. What an impressive title.
Yeah, well, I didn't create it, but yes, I've been in there for more than 5 years.
Well, and I've had the pleasure of chatting with you before, so I really appreciate you joining us. We're going to talk about the budget a little bit tonight, and I wonder what you think about it from a political standpoint. I've been chatting with some other people about the actual content of the budget, but the Liberals are dramatically down in the polls. Do you think that this budget might change things for them?
Well, I think that the first thing we have to say is that, yes, the budget was important for the Liberals politically. It's too early to tell whether this is paying off or not, because we haven't seen that much polling, especially, post-budget, right? So it's too early to draw conclusions of whether this is actually helping the Liberals or not. I think the way they frame the budget, is this focus on younger people, on housing, on the affordability crisis, new social spending, of course, which was announced gradually before the budget in many cases. It's a budget that is, of course, there to please the NDP and NDP supporters. Of course, there is this agreement, supply and confidence agreement between the NDP and the Liberals that was signed more than a year ago. And they also, I think the Liberals think that the votes that they could capture and or maybe recover, the support they could recover, is more on the left of the political spectrum than on the right of the political spectrum. So this is a budget, again, with a relatively large deficit and a lot of new spending. Is it enough? Probably in terms of spending, it's not enough to address the housing crisis. Also, it has triggered a lot of negative reactions from premiers, and from quite a few other people, from some economists and so forth. So the question is to know how ordinary people think about this budget. And yes, I have, listened to a lot of chatter on the radio and on social media and so forth, and read a lot of, comments about the budget. But I think we need polling numbers, and we need more than one or two polls, and we need to have this polling over a number of weeks to know whether this actually made a difference for the Liberals or not. Right now, we just don't have the data to make any assumption about this.
So a lot of the housing strategy and some of the other policies in the budget, but particularly the housing strategy, had almost a equity issue associated with it. It was an intergenerational equity, the way that, or inequity, the way that the government described the challenge that young people have, probably a lot of your students, or graduating students at least, in not being able to afford a house and losing that dream of being able to have a single family home dwelling. Home ownership rates have gone down. Obviously, prices have gone up fairly dramatically. And it almost seems like a real pitch to young people. And I think part of it, a lot of it, is probably the right thing to do economically as well. But it's really this pitch to young people. In the very first election that Justin Trudeau was elected in, my understanding of the statistics are that there was a very dramatic increase in the youth vote and newcomer vote, and that if the same electorate had shown up in the polls as had shown up in the previous election, Stephen Harper would have won. But because Justin Trudeau motivated a huge increase in turnout from young people, the Liberals ended up winning. Some people think it was mainly because of his promise to decriminalize the use of marijuana. What do you think? Is he trying to do the same thing again here? And will it work?
Yes, I think they are trying, not just him, but his team, to frame this budget as a way to address intergenerational equity and to help young people to access property, or at least find an apartment that they can afford, find a place they can afford. So I think, yes, that was the framing in the budget. It was in the speech also by Chrystia Freeland. The question, though, is whether the context is very different from, in 2015, where Justin Trudeau was still a relatively new political leader, and he was, considered as kind of a charismatic figure. And yes, you had some issues like, legalization of pot and so forth. But, this is 9 years later, you cannot recreate something like this, right? Timing is everything. So what they maybe want to do, or they wanted to do with this budget, is at least, maybe foster more support among younger people. But I don't think that they can really think about recreating what happened in 2015 just because of one budget. So how will they basically lure younger people back to the polls? And quite a few younger people actually have turned to the Conservatives, by the way. And then the other younger people who might be more left-leaning but may not show up to vote next time around. I don't think that a budget and what was in it will be enough to do that. But it's part of a strategy to seduce younger voters and to show that the Liberals are on their side. But it might be too little, too late. So again, we'll have to look at polling numbers and so forth. I think what the Liberals are hoping to is that between now and the next federal elections, and if the next federal elections, they can survive until October 2025, that by then interest rates will be lower, and that, inflation will be even lower than it is now because it has declined, right? And then people might be a bit, may, I would say, reward the Liberals for some improvement in, the economic situation that they experience. But again, that might be wishful thinking as well, because, a lot of things can happen between now and October 2025 if we reach that, official election date, because a lot of things can happen between now and then. But they count on really a very good economy and lower interest rates to really to help them at the polls in next year. Or October, maybe earlier in the year. We could still have elections this fall, but I doubt it. They want to postpone the elections as much as possible. And they hope that time and the economic situation, the improvement in the economic situation will help them. But again, it might be a wishful thinking because they've been in power for a long time. And, it's easier to seduce people than to bring them back once they turn away from you. and that's a challenge that the Liberals are facing right now.
That's interesting. It's easier to seduce people than bring them back. Is that something from the dating world that you're using to apply to politics?
Yeah, that's metaphor in a way, yes. But I think that once people have lost trust in you, or that you're no longer a source of hope, they might tolerate you, or they might say, oh, they are not that bad. But there is a term that we use in French, it's usure du pouvoir. Is that the longest you stay in power, the longer people have time to accumulate grievances and basically, find issues with you and it's a kind of they are disenchanted, right? So a lot of people who voted for Trudeau back in 2015, a lot of young people, they are disenchanted with Trudeau, with Justin Trudeau, and with his government, and that's really difficult to bring that back. Once people are disenchanted, you cannot recreate the magic, if you want, of the 2015 campaign. So they will want to use more rational arguments about, maybe what the Conservatives could do in terms of budget cuts, or what the Liberals are doing in terms of housing policy, dental care, pharmacare, although there's not that much yet on the table, but all these issues, childcare, say maybe people will reward us, but it's less about passion, especially if Justin Trudeau stays and remains the Liberal leader and the Prime Minister until the next federal elections. His popularity is way down compared to what it was during his first term. And I don't think you can really recover for it entirely, but people can maybe vote for you again, vote for the Liberals again, because they don't like the alternatives, right? But making a Prime Minister who's been around for nearly a decade super appealing again is almost mission impossible, in my opinion.
I like your description of the French about grievances. I've heard it described as the Seinfeld factor that you only can last 9 seasons, no matter how good you are. You can only last 9 seasons.
Yeah, and in the case of Justin Trudeau, his popularity started to erode during the first term. You remember the SNC-Lavalin affair, for example, and other affairs, other issues, and so I don't think you can recover from all of that. But again, it doesn't mean that I think the Liberals, when we have federal elections, they could still have a chance. Even if they will need to improve their situation in the polls, but campaigns do matter. And we saw that in 2015. But if Justin Trudeau remains the leader, and even if the economy is relatively stable, that unemployment remains quite low, unemployment rate remains quite low, that people have accumulated a lot of grievances, and this disenchantment of the fact that many people who voted for Trudeau in the past don't see him as this charismatic leader or someone who will really bring sunny ways. So is this lack of enthusiasm is a serious challenge for them. And of course, the gap now, we have 20-point gap basically in the
20-point gap. It's unbelievable.
This is really big, and it's hard to recover from that. But they at least want to stay in power as long as possible in the hope that something happens. The budget is one attempt to maybe improve their situation a bit, but I don't think that a budget like this can make a big difference, frankly. Of course, it can help stop the bleeding or avoid further bleeding. But they will need a lot of different things to happen, and including things that they don't control, like lower interest rates, because they cannot tell the Bank of Canada what to do. Exactly. But if interest rates are lower, there's no recession, and the inflation is under control, then it will have, basically, they will then look at Pierre Poilievre and say, well, if Pierre Poilievre makes some mistakes and he says things or that they can frame some aspect of the conservative platform in a negative way. But right now, there's no conservative platform. We don't know exactly what their platform would be for the next federal elections. So Pierre Poilievre is a very good situation. I'm listening to him on social media and in different interviews and the House of Commons. He has a very simple, very clear message. And he talks a bit about alternatives, but, common sense, gros bon sens in French. I mean, and what he said so far is pretty generic, quite general in nature. And the Liberals, of course, during the next campaign will certainly depict Poilievre as someone who will make major cuts.
Very right-wing, Donald Trump
Poilievre
in Canada, etc.
Sorry?
Donald Trump in Canada. We got to take a break for some messages, and we're going to come back in just 2 minutes with Danielle Beland, the director of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada at McGill University, talking about the federal budget. Stay with us, everyone. We're going to talk a little bit about fiscal federalism and how the different parts of Canada have reacted. And we got to talk about this capital gains tax and prosperity, innovation, productivity, etc. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Danielle Beland, Professor Danielle Beland. He's the director of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada at McGill University. Professor Beland is one of those interesting people, I think, who's got obviously a major academic position in Montreal, but he's also worked in Atlantic Canada and the Prairies. He was the assistant professor at Concordia University, and he was an associate professor at the University of Calgary, and he was the Canada Research Chair at the University of Saskatchewan. So you've not worked all across Canada, but in several different places in Canada. How has the different parts of Canada reacted to this? Danielle Smith, the Premier of Alberta, is effectively saying some of these things that you're trying to do, we don't want you to actually talk to our cities and our universities without our approval. The province of Quebec is asking for rights over immigration and things that they haven't had control over before. What is happening in our country, do you think?
I think premiers, they sign a letter. There was a letter sent recently by the Council of the Federation, signed by all the premiers in the territories and also the 10 provincial premiers, pushing back against what they see as really a centralizing budget and centralizing tendencies by this government. And I think that they do have a point. And Justin Trudeau didn't try to hide it and conceal it. He even said, basically, you don't want to do anything. You're not doing enough it's our turn to shine, and in terms of housing policy and so forth. So I think that he ruffs some feathers, and the provinces are fighting back. Quebec,
But is he
of
right
course,
that they're not doing enough?
well, I think that it's the way. I think what happened is that Pierre Poilievre, and I'm not the only one saying this, Pierre Poilievre criticized the Liberals for Justin Trudeau for months and months and months, saying that they were not doing enough to address the cost of living crisis, or even that it was their fault, right? And now they try to do more
Just inflation.
and tell the public they are doing more, and that's what they've done ahead of the budget, making these announcements and on the day of the budget. But then the provinces are not happy about the, what's happening to the respect of their own jurisdiction, that they think that the federal government is invading their areas of jurisdiction, and in some cases rightly so, and so they are fighting back. Now, of course, some of this can be addressed through the implementation of some of these policies, but certainly what we saw with Danielle Smith in Alberta, with this bill, which is basically she borrowed here some borrowed a page from Quebec, actually, because Quebec adopted a law in 1984 to prevent municipalities from receiving money directly from the federal government and dealing directly with the federal government. And Alberta wants to do the same thing and even extend that.
When did Quebec institute that? That's interesting.
Yes. And Alberta has used Quebec a lot. Danielle Smith, and before that, Jason Kenney. And there was a fair deal panel in Alberta, reportedly published in, I think, June 2020. And there was a lot of, citing examples, like examples from Quebec, and a lot of policy ideas to increase the autonomy of Alberta and defend the autonomy of Alberta against the federal government. They actually are inspired, at least in part, from Quebec, which is quite interesting. These are maybe strange bedfellows, but they have quite a bit in common, the sense that this very strong imperative to defend provincial autonomy. In Quebec, it's related to sub-state nationalism. In Alberta, to regionalism, right? In the sense of alienation vis-a-vis the federal government, especially the Trudeau government, of course. And of course, you look also at the map, the electoral map across the country. Yes, the NDP is in power in a couple of provinces, the Liberals in one province, but overall, you look at the map, and most governments in Canada, provincial governments, are right-of-center governments. So it's a very different situation if you compare to late 2015, when the Liberals formed their majority government. The Liberals were in power in Quebec, they were in power in Ontario, and so forth. And it was much easier for them to deal with the provinces, and they found an ally in Premier Wynne and Premier Couillard and so forth. It's much more different now. I mean, Danielle Smith, Doug Ford, of course, Premier Legault here in Quebec. They are very, very critical of the Liberals and of Justin Trudeau. And also remember what happened in 2015, not long before the federal elections, is that the NDP, of course, under Rachel Notley, formed government. And that also helped the Liberals, because when Justin Trudeau became prime minister, one of the provinces that typically is the most critical of the federal government and who's defending provincial autonomy, Alberta, had a NDP prime minister. Sorry, that's the French premier. In Quebec, you say prime minister, premier ministre, even for premiers, right? But he had the NDP premier who was actually quite soft in terms of dealing with the federal government, and ideologically quite aligned with the Liberals, that is kind of center-left, right? Rachel Notley in Alberta was an NDP premier, but if you look at, ideologically what she stood for, she was very close ideologically to the Trudeau government, the federal government. But now it's different, right? And it's very hard for the Liberals. And I think you see the reaction to this budget and to recent announcements, that the danger here for the Liberals, that now they say they are doing a lot to address housing crisis and so forth. And they say that to counter the attacks from Pierre Poilievre. But now they have the provinces basically uniting against them. Of course, this provincial front, might not last, because with federal money, the weaker or poorer provinces might be able to, sign bilateral agreements with the
Well,
federal
and
government, and you can
some people might
push them
say, you
aside.
know what? We do have a
Yeah,
housing problem, and you
yeah,
know, incentivizing some of these cities to pass some of these rules and get rid of some of the red tape and roadblocks to allow housing to be developed actually might make a lot of sense. I got to change topics,
yeah.
Professor Beland. Let's turn to, you know, the business, the
Yes.
prosperity agenda for a second, if I could. You know, one of the things that that the institute was this increase in the capital gains tax rate, effectively by increasing the inclusion rate above, I think it's $200,000. It has gotten an incredible amount of negative blowback from, you know, bankers, from rich people, from the business pages, from entrepreneurs, from innovators, etc. And you know, number one, it's the specific issue, but number two, lots of people are saying that there's not an innovation or productivity or prosperity or growth agenda in the federal government and in this budget, that it's all about redistribution and it's not about innovation growing the pie. And the fact that the capital gains tax rate is increased is going to scare off innovation, and it's just proof positive that that we don't have this growth agenda. What do you think of that, sir?
Well, there are two things in this. I think we have to distinguish what's happening with capital gains and the growth agenda more generally. I think for the growth agenda, or, you know, fostering innovation and so forth, I think that this budget is lacking. It's not that there is nothing in it for it, but it's been criticized by a lot of economists, including people I work with and so forth, who are, you know, who I respect, like Trevor Tomb or you know, others. But Chris Reagan here at McGill. But I do think that the issue on capital gains and the change in, you know, the change in the inclusion of capital gains in terms of taxation, I think that yes, there was a lot of negative reactions to it. But you mentioned bankers, people in the financial industry, and rich people. I mean, in a way, the liberals are not necessarily unhappy about this, because their argument is that we'll tax the rich, right? And it's a budget focusing on younger people. People who will not, most people who will be affected by this are not necessarily young people, right? And it's also a pretty technical change. So I think, yes, in some circles, people are talking about it and are critical of it. But I'm not sure our ordinary Canadians who don't necessarily even are not affected by this and don't necessarily understand the technical point here, that this will, you know, lead them to say, stop supporting the liberals if they are supporting them. But I think this issue about that the focus is more on spending and on redistribution than on investment in innovation and so forth, I think that is fair criticism. You can, of course, do both, but at some point you will need to find the money to do both. And the thing about capital gains is that they say it will, you know, we talk about $19 billion over 5 years, but I'm not even sure they will be able to raise that money. But we have a deficit of, you know, if you have a deficit is much larger than that. And that's what they say they will bring in over 5 years. So I think this calls into question the myth, I think, that you can balance budgets or compensate for large social programs simply by taxing the rich, quote unquote. And even Pierre Poilievre is saying they're not really taxing the rich, because many people will, you know, they will actually just make their decisions by June 25th, and then they won't have to face this burden, right? So, but I do think that this move was a way to, again, emphasize the issue of redistribution and something that typically will please younger voters and especially people who are prone to vote NDP, right? But the NDP is saying it's not enough. We should tax the rich more, right? And so they are criticizing on both the left and the right over this, and maybe they are happy with this. And Chrystia Freeland said it in her budget speech. This is something that will be controversial. So they expected some pushback on this, and in a way, pushback if it's from people that you know, who are you know, perceived as rich or entitled. Then from the perspective of ordinary voters, younger voters, people on the left, the political spectrum, then for them politically, it might not be a bad thing at all.
So is this just the creation of a wedge issue between the rich and the right, versus the young and the left?
I think that we'll see whether the Liberals go further in that direction, because they could have done more, right? And that's what the NDP is saying. We'll see what will happen with the Liberal platform in the next federal elections. Will they try to really have this, class issue? And they could superimpose class and age, right? But they have to be careful, because older people vote more than younger people. Even if you increase political participation of younger people, you still have this reality that older people just vote more. And it's not just the case in Canada, it's elsewhere around the world, at least in advanced industrial countries. So the Liberals have to be careful what they wish for here. But you can say that while people are talking about this, which is a relatively technical change, they are not talking about other things. And now people are not saying, well, the Liberals are not doing enough regarding housing. They may say they don't adopt the right approach, which is what Pierre Poilievre is saying. They might be saying that they are invading provincial jurisdiction, is what the premiers are saying. But now it's no longer the idea that the Liberals are not doing anything. They are doing something. They are doing something in terms of housing, and they are even doing something in terms of taxing the rich, quote unquote. But the question is to know whether they will move further in that direction, that is further to the left in terms of taxation, in terms of actual measures, not just the rhetoric of say, we'll tax the rich, but whether they will do it and what consequences this will have electorally for them. But right now, what we see in this budget is still a relatively modest measure in terms of how much money it will actually generate, right? If you say 19 billion over 5 years, which might be optimistic, it's only a small fraction of if you add the 5 deficits in a row we'll have between now and then, it's a small portion of that deficit that will be compensated by this change in the inclusion of capital gains. So I think we are making a lot of fuss over this, but I don't think that this might prevent us from seeing the big picture. And you're right about innovation, about investing in economic growth. But this, in and of itself, this measure is, again, as a standalone measure, it's probably not that a big thing, but it's the bigger context, I think, that's important here.
So former Minister of Finance, Bill Morneau, I think, wrote a book that said we don't have a growth prosperity agenda in the government, and certainly those type of people in cabinet. I think the statistics have been that we've had 15 years of no growth in real median disposable income, that our prosperity was about proximate equal to the United States a decade ago, and to now it's 71%. Is there enough attention on productivity, innovation, prosperity?
No, I don't think so. I think it's absolutely crucial. We have to find a balance. I think social spending is important, and some of the social policy initiatives that the Liberals have put forward are important. But if we want to invest both in economic development and in redistribution and social programs, at some point we'll have to tell Canadians that we'll need to change our tax system, and it's not just the rich that will have to pay more, but most Canadians. And that's not a message that the Liberals want to tell people. Even the NDP, they say, oh, by taxing the rich, we'll be able to pay for all these goodies, all these programs. It's not the way it's done, even in Scandinavia. Go to Sweden, go to Denmark, and I've been there quite a few times, or Norway. It's the tax burden. They have a very high value, very value added taxation, right? Here in Canada, we have a GST at 5%. I mean, yes, of course, you have the PST and harmonized tax and so forth, but it's quite modest compared to what people spend in social democratic countries in terms of what they pay in terms of some forms of taxation. It's a higher fiscal burden, and people complain about higher taxes there too. But at some point, we'll have to tell people the truth, that you cannot have the cake and eat it, and that at some point, and you cannot just basically have the cake, eat it, and have only a small portion of the population paying for it, because it just doesn't work that way in the real world.
So you're a student of politics of government. You direct the school on Canada. What do you think is we've had this issue on carbon tax, axe the tax. We've had big controversy on freedom. We have seen partisanship and polarization in Canada, I don't know, like never before, at least in what I've seen and what I've experienced. Does Trudeau have a chance? or do the Liberals have to change their leader, or is Poilievre in without a doubt, no matter what the Liberals do?
Well, no, there is still a possibility for the Liberals to turn things around to a certain extent, not to go back to the enthusiasm of 2015 and so forth, as I mentioned earlier, around Justin Trudeau. The thing is that if Justin Trudeau leaves, who will replace him, and will this person be actually able to turn things around? I'm not convinced that it's the case. And so another thing that's important too is that now they decided to stick to the carbon tax, and I think with carbon pricing, I think it's a good thing, because actually most economists, they agree that it's actually sound policy, public policy, and even conservative economists in the old days, at least, they supported this idea, right? And again, my colleague Chris Reagan at McGill, who's not a socialist by any means, is a very strong advocate of carbon pricing, and I think that here, the Liberals, although they didn't frame the policy properly. We say Justin Trudeau, is like selfies and he's very conscious of his public image and so forth. But in terms of explaining his policies to people, he's been quite atrocious in some cases, not just him, but his government. And I think the carbon pricing has not been framed appropriately. Now they try to frame it as a rebate and so forth. But it's, again, too little, too late. So some of the policies that they have done are actually good for the country, I think, in the long run, but they have been poorly explained, poorly framed, and that gave an opportunity for the opposition, especially the Conservatives, to come up with very simplistic slogans like "axe the tax," and also pretending, for example, that for months and months they were campaigning in Quebec against the carbon tax, but it doesn't apply to Quebec. So again, these are pretty complex issues, but the Conservatives have found a way to reduce them to slogans, and it's been working for them. And the Liberals, in terms of have not been able to respond to that in an effective way. And I don't think this budget will really change much in that regard.
Professor Daniel Beland, thank you so much for joining us and talking about the budget and how I think housing and appealing to intergenerational inequity and youth is one of the key aspects of this budget, and that I think the other thing is that we do need a prosperity agenda, and the capital tax may be a small little factor against that, but probably overblown. I agree with you, but I think we need deeper, more critical measures to spur innovation, to spur productivity, to spur prosperity. So I really appreciate you joining us tonight, sir.
You're most welcome. Take care.
We're going to take a break and come back with some of my own comments in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everyone.